Hey, it's Jer. Welcome to your Daily Detroit for Wednesday, September 2nd, 2020. On today's show, headlines around town including more information on Ford's job cuts and a mystery hearse pulled out of the Detroit River. Then, Brenna Houck from Eater Detroit joins me to talk about the state's new COVID outbreak tracking data and the prospects of restaurants and bars going forward. Let's just get started. Real quick, here is the latest with the COVID numbers. With 524 cases reported Wednesday and 14 confirmed deaths in Michigan, the statewide pandemic case total is now north of 103,700. There have been more than 6,500 deaths. The RT, or transmission rate of the virus, sits at 1.02, which is a slight improvement. Overall, the cases per 100,000 rate in the Tri-County area of Oakland, Macomb, and Wayne counties is slightly improving. Macomb is almost on the verge of getting into a more controlled territory around the virus, and that's all according to the Harvard Global Health Institute. Federal Coronavirus Task Force member Dr. Deborah Birx visited Michigan today, and she said that, quote, "Going into Labor Day, please wear your mask. We're seeing crowded neighborhood events as primary COVID-19 spreaders." However, Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer asked Dr. Birx for a national mask mandate, a request Dr. Birx rejected. She said she believes mandates are best from the states. For about 4 years, a hearse has sat at the bottom of the Detroit River near the end of Harrison Street in Trenton. The News Herald reports that police in Grosse Ile, Trenton, and the Downriver Dive Team worked together to pull the vehicle up today as part of a training exercise. The hearse was about 20 feet below water and came up in multiple pieces. Police say they have no report of a missing hearse and that there's no reason to suspect foul play, though they do want to try and track down the owner. I will put a full link to the piece in the show notes, and if you're missing a hearse, maybe they got one for you. Yesterday, we told you that Ford Motor Company was reportedly looking at making cuts to its salaried workforce. On Wednesday, the automaker made it official, saying it's looking for 1,400 people in the United States to take a voluntary buyout. That's up from an estimated 1,000 jobs in initial reports. The buyouts will be available to salaried employees who are eligible for retirement as of December 31st, according to the Detroit News. Eligible employees have until October 23rd to opt in and would leave the company by the end of the year. The buyout also includes corporate jobs at Ford Credit, its financial services division. If Ford does not get 1,400 people to take the voluntary buyouts, it will have to conduct what it called, quote, involuntary separations, unquote. The cuts are part of Ford's $11 billion global restructuring. All 4 of Detroit's stadiums will be used to support voting in the city. The latest is that Little Caesars Arena will become a central training center for more than 6,000 volunteer election workers through September and October. Comerica Park has been made available to host a ballot drop box should the city need additional locations. And in case you missed it, about a week ago, the Detroit Lions said they'd work with the city of Detroit and the Michigan Secretary of State to support elections. How will they do this? Well, Ford Field will become home to 8 of Detroit's 12 receiving boards. Those are independent groups who take in cast ballots in a secure manner and make sure that the proper steps are followed that would allow for a recount if necessary. In other news around election help, retail chain Old Navy is getting into the game. They have a number of locations in Metro Detroit. They're paying store employees for 8 hours if they serve as poll workers for the 2020 election. They also would be eligible for the stipend that local municipalities often offer to support election workers. Contributor Laura Khalil did an episode with us on how to become a poll worker yourself, and if you're interested, I will link back in the feed. Go have a listen. A quick bit of housekeeping before we get to Brenna. First, if you have feedback on the show, story ideas, or more, there are a couple of ways to get a hold of us. You can leave a voicemail at 313-789-3211. That's 313-789-3211. Or send me an email at jer@dailydetroit.com. I'll be sure it goes where it needs to go. Second, remember to become a member and support this project. It makes a huge difference in helping defray the costs, and we can add more voices and more depth to the podcast. You can do that at patreon.com/dailydetroit. That's patreon.com/dailydetroit. Joining me on the line is Brenna Houck. She is from Eater Detroit. It's good to talk to you again.
I'm glad to be back.
So basically, everything seems to be tied, even in the culinary world, to coronavirus lately. And the latest is that we actually are starting to get an idea of what's happening with outbreaks. You know, there's been so much talk around, do bars spread? Do restaurants spread? How many cases? All this kind of stuff. But we didn't really have too much hard data in Michigan, did we?
I think that this isn't just a Michigan problem. It's definitely like a nationwide problem with just reporting data. Different states have been spotty in how they offer data and report it. Obviously, at first, they had to create a whole new system for, how to account for all this data that they were getting about COVID because nobody knew anything about it. But now I think finally, enough people have asked for it that the state started to publish publicly the data that it has on outbreaks in different industries and settings. They started that on August 20th. So that's going to start to maybe give us a little bit of a clearer picture of, what different settings are driving outbreaks. I think it's hard. People hear, numbers of people with positive COVID tests, really understand what's the risk of these different settings. And each setting has a different risk. We know that businesses where there's, face-to-face interactions have a lot more risk. Early on, there was a lot of concern about grocery store workers because they were dealing with the most people. Because at that time when we were all in our stay-at-home orders, we were only interacting with grocery stores, really. And so grocery store workers were getting sick at higher rates. And now we're seeing more outbreaks in, food processing facilities and agriculture, especially during the summer, because that's the season when there's lots of harvest. And there's not much room for social distancing, and there may not be as much care being taken for PPE and other things.
I know it's super early, but are there any trends that we can look at? I mean, one of the things that I look at, taking a look at your piece on Eater, which we will link to, is that, you've even got to decode stuff because, Region 2S represents the city of Detroit and Monroe, Washtenaw, and Wayne counties. And then there's 2N representing Macomb, Oakland, and St. Clair. And it's kind of Byzantine, if you will. But have you been able to kind of see some things early on?
I'm most interested because I report for Detroit. I'm most interested in the regions around Detroit. So 2N and 2S. And it does seem like there are a number of new and ongoing outbreaks in those regions, at least the past 2 weeks that we've had a chance to look at. But overall trends, the state has been focusing on agriculture facilities, food processing, and migrant camps, trying to make sure that people in those facilities are getting tested. I'm interested to see how that impacts the numbers on outbreaks in those types of settings, because it's really difficult right now, especially with bars and restaurants, to see how current policies have impacted those industries because we only have data from August, right? We don't have data going back to May when we were still in lockdown. So it's hard to see whether closing bars for indoor service had an impact on how many outbreaks. It does seem like there are fewer outbreaks at bars than there are at restaurants from week to week, at least the 2 weeks that I've had a chance to look at. But that could also be other things, like there's fewer bars that are open because they really can't make as much money as they used to before. I know a lot of bars haven't reopened still, especially dive bars and things that traditionally were very indoor and had inexpensive drinks. It probably doesn't make as much sense for them to reopen immediately.
I have noticed just looking at menus and things that it seems like prices are up a little bit. And I know that for a lot of people, they're really only going to do patio if they do that. A lot of folks still aren't going out to drink. They're still doing the stay-at-home kind of situation. It's not like business has returned to previous levels, even for the places that are outdoors.
No, I mean, I'm hearing from restaurant and bar owners that things are slowly creeping up again, but it's still not, what it was before the pandemic. And it just won't be because they're at 50% capacity. And yeah, as you mentioned, at the same time, there's a lot of new costs that are driving up prices for restaurants and bars. Bars, if they're doing to-go cocktails, obviously they would have to pay for the containers and things to sell you that to-go cocktail. It's not like they get to reuse the glass for the next customer after they wash, of course, like they would if you were doing indoor service. And the same for restaurants. They have to pay for more PPE now than they did before. So the masks for their workers, the gloves, and all of that is more expensive than it was pre-pandemic. And it's now required for the safety of employees and customers. So those are all new costs that are really driving up the prices. And then again, the other piece is that there have been these larger outbreaks at food processing facilities, and that's driven up prices on food itself. So, the raw ingredients that these businesses need to make the food that they're selling to you. So all of those things are kind of getting folded into a higher price for your meal or your drink overall.
Well, speaking of those restaurant challenges, word came earlier this week that Magnet, one of the kind of hot shot, well-known rising stars as far as restaurants in the city of Detroit, that they are closing their doors and not going to reopen, and that you report about a dissolving of the hospitality group. I kind of wanted to talk more on a greater scale of, yes, there is that individual case, but I feel like that could be a harbinger of things to come.
Yeah, I think that there's been a lot of talk throughout this pandemic about, how much longer can restaurants and bars hold out, especially ones that have leases or didn't really adapt as well to takeout and delivery. These are all, costs, and especially the rent portion of that could be an ongoing cost for a lot of businesses. Some landlords have been good at giving rent relief to their renters, but others are less willing. They might also be, hoping that they can get someone else to move in and pay the regular price. There's all these, outside forces. And obviously adding a layer to that is the fact that the federal government hasn't passed any new relief for states, for unemployed workers, and small businesses like restaurants have been particularly acutely hit by the pandemic, by just like the aspect of physical distancing, all of these things that kind of made it more difficult to give the kind of hospitality that we were used to before. And that has made it more difficult for them to also get the grants and the loans that they need to get through the pandemic. A lot of restaurants, they were nervous to touch their PPP loans if they did receive them because they were worried that they might not be able to repay them. A lot of restaurants now say that if things go on like this for much longer, they might have to consider closing locations or closing down for a little while. Or a lot of them are just, hoping for some sort of like zero interest loan or something that they can get from the government. But at this point, it's not really looking like the federal government is going to come to any sort of an agreement. The House and the Senate seem to be pretty divided.
Yeah. Before we got on the air, we were talking a little bit about basically that winter was coming. Can you, quickly talk about that? And like for listeners who may not know, like why winter could be a really bad thing for these restaurants?
Early on in the pandemic, it was in the spring, it was still cold out. So a lot of people were still dining inside if they were dining out. And then obviously dining rooms were closed. So businesses had to go to carry out, and we all know that. And so summer was like a real boon for businesses. Obviously, the state allowed a lot of cities to expand outdoor dining for businesses, make it easier to do outdoor dining because it's considered to be a safer option than dining indoors. And that's allowed businesses to kind of recover some of the financial losses that they've had during the pandemic. Like they might be able to add enough seating to account for the seating that they lost indoors. But especially in northern states like Michigan, it gets cold and then it stays cold for a large part of the year. And if diners aren't comfortable dining indoors soon, or if it's not safe, or if numbers spike in the fall, then it could make for a very challenging situation for restaurants. It's hard to make outdoor dining hospitable when it's 10 degrees outside. I'm sure we'll see a lot of those plastic igloos this year. I mean, I'm not even sure if those are like a safe option. I can't say for sure, but like I know a lot of businesses are talking about creating like temporary structures. I'm sure some of your listeners have maybe seen that Batch Brewing Company has been building an outdoor dining barn essentially in their parking lot.
Wow.
So a lot of businesses are starting to think about winter and how they're going to be able to serve customers and pivot again, because they just were finally starting to recover, and some are just now starting to reopen, and now they're already thinking about how they have to pivot again for winter.
Oof. Well, Brenna, I really thank you for all of your insight. I will be sure to put a link to the stories we talked about on Detroit.eater.com in the show notes. And, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate your insight in what's happening out there when it comes to eating, drinking, and Detroit.
Yeah, thank you. And please read Eater Detroit. We're covering this all the time. Thank you.
Donuts.
A quick note that after we recorded this conversation, we learned that longtime Detroit staple Dutch Girl Donuts is reopening September 8th. There are more details to come, but it's on Woodward, just south of 7 Mile. If you do not know about this place, now you know. There were worries that they weren't going to make it since they have been closed for a while with pretty much little information or communication. So yes, there is much excitement about this development over here at the Elger House Studios. And we are done for today. Thank you so much for listening to Your Daily Detroit. I gave you the pitch earlier in the show, so you know what to do. I'm not going to repeat it. Thank you so much for listening. With that, I'm Jared Stays. Take care of each other, and we'll get through this together. Talk with you tomorrow.